My name is Carlos. I've had many experiences throughout my life, but none of them were as disturbing as what happened on a cold and dark night in the forest, in a secluded area far from the city. I've always been fascinated by nature, and that's why I decided to take a solitary walk in a forest reserve that I knew by name, but had never had the courage to explore. On that autumn night, the sky was covered with heavy clouds, and a thick fog started to form as I entered the woods. The forest was dense, with tall, imposing trees, their leaves gently swaying in the cold wind. The air was humid, and I could smell the strong scent of wet earth, something comforting but at the same time unsettling. The walk started off peaceful, with only the sound of dry leaves under my feet, and the distant call of some nocturnal animal breaking the silence. The sound of the wind blended with the faint cracking of the trees, but I knew that was normal. The forest has its own life, with sounds that we can't always identify. However, as I ventured deeper into the woods, a discomfort began to form. It wasn't fear, but something more subtle, a sense that I wasn't alone anymore. Something was watching me.
The path narrowed as I went further, and soon I began to notice that the trail was more desolate than I had imagined. I couldn't say how much time had passed since I entered the forest, but the night seemed denser and the atmosphere heavier. I paused for a moment to take a sip of water, and when I looked up, I realized the moon wasn't visible.
A thick cloud was hiding it, creating an even darker surrounding. The only light I had came from my flashlight, whose beams cut through the fog, mostly illuminating only a small piece of the path ahead. That's when I heard a sound that made me freeze. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the usual cracking of the trees I'm used to hearing on the trails. It was a whisper, a few more steps, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The whispering sound grew louder, but again I couldn't make out what it was saying. It was as if the wind was carrying words to my ear, but I knew there was no wind. The stillness of the forest was absolute, and the air felt even denser and heavier. I hurried a little, starting to feel a growing sense of unease, as though I was being followed. That's when I finally saw it. My flashlight illuminated a small point of light ahead, a faint glow that appeared to be a reflection on something metallic. As I got closer, I realized it was an old, rusted iron cross buried in the ground, covered in moss and dry leaves. I crouched to take a better look, and what I found sent a deep shiver through me. The cross was displaced as if it had been buried there forcibly, and I had never heard of any place in the forest with something like that. I stood there for a few seconds, touching the cross, and then I noticed something strange. Around me, everything was in absolute silence. There were no more sounds from the forest, as if the world had stopped for a moment. The instant I withdrew my hand from the cross, I felt a pressure on my back. Something was there, close to me, and I could feel its presence, but I couldn't see it. The air had grown colder, and my whole body went tense. It was as if the weight of something invisible was watching me, judging me. I quickly stood up and began walking back down the trail, my heart racing, my hands sweating. The walk back was hurried and terrifying. What had once seemed like a familiar path now turned into a labyrinth. I no longer knew if I was heading in the right direction. The trees seemed to close in around me, forming walls of shadows that suffocated me. The whisper once again returned, but this time it wasn't distant. It was as if it was right behind me, and I didn't dare to look. Fear made me run. Every step seemed faster, more rushed, but at the same time the path never seemed to end. With every turn, I expected to see the exit of the forest, but the darkness seemed endless. I just wanted to get out of there. When I finally saw a light in the distance, I ran towards it, and when I got there, I realized it was the entrance to the trail. The forest seemed to have swallowed my courage, leaving only a sense of emptiness and dread. When I finally left the forest, the sounds of life returned. Birds were singing, and the gentle breeze brought me back to the real world. But deep down, I knew there was something more in that forest, something that shouldn't be challenged, something that will never leave me. To this day, whenever I pass near that reserve, I can't help but feel the chill running down my spine. Something has been following me since that night. It's not something I can see, but I know it's there, always watching, and somehow that haunts me more than any visible apparition. My name is Julia. Like many people, I'm fascinated by supernatural stories and have always enjoyed exploring unknown places, especially those with a dark past. I had heard about an old house located about 20 minutes outside of the city near an abandoned road. People said it had been empty for decades, but I always felt there was something more, something strange behind that story. So, I decided that I would visit it. It was an autumn afternoon when I went there. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and the strong icy wind made the trees around me sway violently. As I approached the house, I could see the decaying structure. The paint was faded, and the windows were broken, with glass scattered on the ground as if time had worn everything down. The gate, made of rusty iron, creaked with every gust of wind. I wasn't sure exactly what was drawing me to this place, but an invisible force seemed to push me inside. I entered through the slightly open door, and the sound of my boots echoed through the dark hallway. The smell was of mildew, something heavy, and the air was dense. The walls were covered with a thick layer of dust, and the floor creaked with every step I took. I looked around and realized the house seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. The furniture was destroyed, as if something had happened there that forced the inhabitants to leave without looking back. I felt strange, as if I was intruding on a place no longer meant for humans. I walked into the main room and found an old bookshelf filled with dusty books. In the corner of the room, there was a cold, extinguished fireplace, covered with dry ashes. I looked up at the ceiling and noticed the house was almost falling apart. But what caught my attention the most was a painting hanging on the wall. It was an old portrait of a woman, an elderly lady with grey hair and a serious, almost penetrating gaze. The painting was slightly tilted, as if it had been moved recently. Something in her eyes made me uncomfortable, as though she was watching me back. A shiver ran down my spine, but I continued exploring. I didn't want to leave without discovering what was inside that house. I decided to climb the creaky stairs, which were covered with tattered old rugs. The second floor was even darker and more desolate than the first. The hallway was narrow and poorly lit, with only the sound of the wood creaking breaking the absolute silence. I went to the room that seemed to be the largest in the house. The door was slightly open, and I pushed it with an increasing sense of anxiety. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but what caught my attention was an old rocking chair in the center of the room. The chair was still, but a strange feeling began to form inside me. It seemed alive. I approached it slowly, and when I touched the arm of the chair, a wave of coldness ran through my entire body. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the mirror on the wall. The reflection was blurry, and I couldn't distinguish what was there. But something deep down told me not to look. But like any curious person, I was overwhelmed by the need to know what was reflected there. I approached the mirror, and when I looked, I saw a figure. It wasn't mine nor any other human's. It was a pale figure with a distorted, almost translucent silhouette. It was standing behind me, its eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move my feet. I was paralyzed with fear, trying to understand what was happening. However, before I could react, the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced, and I felt an indescribable fear take over me. But I didn't know what to do. The atmosphere was colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified with every second. I knew I shouldn't stay there, but at the same time, something told me to remain. I continued walking through the house, the sound of my steps echoing through the empty rooms. I returned to the hallway, and as I looked toward the end of it, I saw a door open. I had never noticed that door before, and as much as I wanted to leave, an invisible force seemed to guide me toward it. Trembling all over, I went to the door and entered what seemed to be an office or library. The air was denser there, and the light coming through the broken windows had a strange hue, almost as if it were distorted. On the old wooden desk there was a letter, a yellowed, folded letter. I couldn't resist and picked it up. What was written made me swallow hard. The words were shaky, but they said, "I know you came. Don't run, for you are already lost." My body froze. That message seemed to be written for me, as if they knew I would be there, at that hour, in that house. Fear completely consumed me, and without thinking, I threw the letter on the floor and ran toward the door. When I was almost at the exit, I heard the sound of the rocking chair creaking again. I looked back and saw the chair moving on its own. The sound grew louder, and for a moment, the air seemed to be sucked into the house, as if something were trying to keep me there. I didn't look back anymore, and in a desperate impulse ran to the gate. As soon as I left the house, the relief was immediate, but the feeling of something chasing me didn't let me find peace for days. To this day, whenever I pass by that road, I feel a chill that I can't explain. I know what I saw in that house wasn't just an illusion of my mind. Something there still watches me, and no matter how hard I try to forget, the sensation of being observed never fully disappears. My name is Felipe. I'm 32 years old. Nothing extraordinary happens around here. Well, at least that's what I thought until that night. An experience that, to this day, makes me question everything I believed about what is real and what is not. It was a Saturday night, a little before 11 p.m. I was at home alone watching a movie. The house was silent, and the only things breaking the silence were the sounds from the television and the faint creaking of the windows because of the wind. I lived in an old house in the center of the city, a house that was over 40 years old and, honestly, not very well preserved. The walls were worn out, and the wooden floor creaked with the slightest movement. However, it was my home, and I knew it like the back of my hand. When I finished watching the movie around midnight, I decided to turn off the lights and head to my bedroom. The house was in complete silence, something a little unusual, but nothing that scared me. I was tired, so I decided to lie down and try to sleep as quickly as possible. I closed my eyes, but something seemed wrong. I was lying there in complete darkness, but I couldn't relax. There was a tension in the air, a sense of discomfort that I couldn't explain. The room felt colder than usual, and I started hearing a very faint sound, almost inaudible, coming from downstairs. It was the sound of footsteps. Already somewhat sleepy, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be the sound of something falling or the wind moving the doors, but the footsteps continued. At first I thought it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me while I tried to fall asleep, but the footsteps were becoming clearer, louder, as if someone was actually walking through the house, downstairs. They weren't hurried or stealthy steps, but calm steps, as if the person knew exactly where they were stepping, as if they were at home. The problem was, I knew I was alone. I quickly got out of bed, my heart racing, and went to the door of my room. The house was dark and silent, and as I heard the footsteps, my mind started filling with questions. Who could be there? How did they get in? I froze for a moment, trying to rationalize what was happening. But when I heard the footsteps again, I felt an urgent need to find out what was going on. I crouched down as much as I could, trying to make the least amount of noise, and started heading down the stairs. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the carpet, but the tension in the air was making me paranoid. As I descended, I felt an increasing chill, as if each step brought me closer to something I didn't want to find. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the living room was completely dark. I reached out to turn on the light, but suddenly, everything became even quieter. The footsteps had stopped. My mind was racing, and my body was frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. I tried to breathe deeply, but the feeling that something or someone was there was undeniable. I walked a little around the living room, sneaking towards the kitchen door, which was slightly ajar. The sound was coming from there. I hesitated for a second, but slowly pushed the door open. Inside the kitchen, nothing. The room was empty, but something was out of place. The wooden chair was slightly turned toward the table, as if someone had gotten up and left quickly, leaving everything in disarray. That's when I noticed something strange. A window, which always stayed closed, was open, but there was no sign that anyone had passed through there. The wind wasn't strong, but the cold night air seemed to have invaded the house, creating an even more unusual feeling. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall and saw that it was already past 1 a.m. The house was silent again, but the feeling of being watched never left. Just as I was about to go back to my room, something made a loud noise coming from upstairs. It was the sound of a piece of furniture being moved, a heavy and dragging sound. I froze, not knowing what to do. It couldn't be my imagination, and there was no way someone could be up there without me hearing or seeing them. I don't know what got into me, but I went to the stairs again and started to go up. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the sound of my footsteps echoed strangely through the silent house. When I reached the top, I saw something that made me freeze immediately. The door to my room was open, and I was absolutely sure I had closed it before I went downstairs. A feeling of anguish took over me, but I kept going, approaching the door to my room. When I looked inside, I saw no one. However, in the corner of the wall next to the bed, something was there. A shadow. It wasn't a person, but a shape, something that seemed made of a dense, almost liquid darkness. The shadow wasn't moving, but it was there, still, as if it was waiting for something. I was paralyzed for a moment, unable to react. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I didn't know whether I should run or try to understand what was happening. The sense of weight in the air grew. The shadow seemed to distort as if it was alive, but at the same time trapped. For a moment, I felt there was no escape. All I wanted was to wake up from this nightmare, but the feeling of not being alone in that room consumed me. When I gathered the courage to move, the shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the cold and tension in the air remained.
I ran to my room and locked the door. I sat there on the bed, not knowing what to do. The silence in the house returned, but the feeling that something or someone was still there, watching, never left. I spent the night wide awake, unable to sleep, listening for any suspicious sound. To this day, whenever I am home alone, the feeling of being watched returns. I know that what happened that night wasn't an illusion, and I'm still sure I wasn't alone in that house.
My name is Jacob. This happened about 5 years ago when some friends and I decided to spend a weekend at a country house, isolated by a lake. The house, located in a remote area, was rented by a friend of a friend, and we had no idea what awaited us. The place was beautiful, peaceful, but at the same time there was something that felt a bit dark in the air. This happened about 5 years ago when some friends and I decided to spend a weekend at a country house, isolated by a lake. The house, located in a remote area, was rented by a friend of a friend, and we had no idea what awaited us. The place was beautiful, peaceful, but at the same time there was something that felt a bit dark in the air. At first everything seemed perfect for a relaxing time. Fresh air, nature around us, and the calm water of the lake reflecting the sky. We arrived at the house in the late afternoon after a long day of travel. It was a large house made of wood, with a rustic style but well kept, with a spacious porch facing directly onto the lake. The first impression was that the place was charming, and everyone was excited about the weekend ahead. The house was empty when we arrived, except for some old furniture, but the owner had left us some basic instructions on how to use the place and asked us to take care of the property during our stay. As soon as we entered, the first thing I noticed was the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. The house, although well kept, had a peculiar smell, as if it had been closed up for a long time. The light was soft, but at the same time the atmosphere seemed to have a darker tone than necessary, something I only began to notice as I became more accustomed to the environment. But soon I dismissed this feeling. After all, we were in a remote place, away from everything, and the isolated setting was exactly what we were all looking for. We settled in, and night fell quickly. During dinner, we chatted about trivial things, laughed, and made plans for the next day. But it was when the night deepened that the atmosphere in the house started to change. The first sign of something strange happened when we were in the living room, chatting by the fireplace. We heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. It was a low sound, like something sliding or being dragged slowly. Some of us thought it could be the wind, since the area had many trees, but the noise persisted, and the atmosphere began to grow tense. I was the first to go upstairs to see what it was, convinced it was just some wood creaking from the wind, as the house was very old. The wooden stairs creaked with each step I took, and I was trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. But when I reached the top, the sense of discomfort intensified. The hallway was completely silent, but when I looked down, I saw that the door to one of the rooms was slightly ajar. I didn't remember anyone opening the door, but I decided to investigate. I entered the room and looked around. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but when I ran my hand over the table, I felt something cold. as if a breeze had passed through there, even though there was no explanation for it. I looked around, trying to notice anything that could give me an answer. But before I could continue my search, something caught my attention. In the corner of the wall, there was an old painting in a dark wooden frame. The portrait was of an elderly woman with white hair and a serious, almost unyielding expression. What disturbed me wasn't the painting itself, but the fact that the woman's eyes seemed to follow me. I felt uncomfortable and quickly decided to return downstairs. When I came down, I told everyone what had happened, but no one seemed too concerned. Maybe the tension was just in my head after all. The house was old and it was normal for it to make strange sounds. However, as the night went on, things started to get even stranger. Around 3 a.m. we woke up to an even louder noise coming from upstairs. I was already awake, and for some reason I felt compelled to investigate again. I got up silently and went up the stairs, this time more apprehensive. When I reached the top, the hallway seemed even darker. However, when I passed the room with the portrait of the woman, I noticed something terrifying. The door was now wide open and the painting that had been hanging on the wall was now lying on the floor. Not only that, but the frame was cracked. The feeling of fear settled in my stomach, but the worst was yet to come. When I bent down to look closer, I saw something that made my heart stop. The wall where the painting had been hanging had hand marks on it. Marks as if someone had touched the wall with dirty hands. Something that looked like blood but wasn't. I couldn't explain it, but it seemed as though the wall had been touched with force, as if someone had tried to escape from something there. I quickly backed away, and at that moment I felt like it wasn't safe to be there anymore. The environment felt hostile, and the sense that something was approaching me quickly grew. I couldn't control my fear anymore, so I decided to go back downstairs. I rushed down to the lower floor and started warning everyone about what had happened. We were all terrified, but at the same time, no one wanted to admit that this was really happening. The tension was palpable, but the fear of exploring the place further was even greater. The worst happened when the next day we decided to go out to the lake to try to clear our heads. But when we got there, something even more bizarre occurred. The water of the lake was strangely murky, and at one point, we saw something moving beneath the surface, like a shadow slowly crawling. We all froze, not knowing what to do. But before we could react, the shadow disappeared, leaving only the calm, murky water behind. That's when we decided to leave the house. We quickly packed our things, and when we got into the car, I looked back one last time at the lake. In the distance, it seemed like someone was standing at the water's edge, watching us leave. But when I looked again, no one was there. Our weekend ended earlier than we expected. I still don't know exactly what happened in that house, but I can guarantee that something was there. I don't know if it was the spirit of the woman in the portrait or something darker, but the fact is, it wasn't an illusion, and the fear we felt was real. To this day, whenever I pass through that area, I feel a chill run down my spine, and the feeling that something is watching me never goes away completely. And these were the stories for today. Like the video if you enjoyed today's stories. Comment on what type of stories you like the most. See you in the next video.